Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Keown from the Percussion Collective, and thank you for joining us. Today, I'm here with co-host Terry Sweeney, who's a fellow member of the collective, and Bob van Sice, the artistic director of the ensemble. And Doug Perry is our producer. So thank you all so much for being here. And we're honored to be joined by two special guests. We have Garth Neustadter, who is the composer of Seaborn, and Kjell van Sice, the videographer on the project. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Wonderful. And for everyone who is listening, this is going to be a live Q&A. And so if you have any questions for Garth or for Kjell, please send them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So the topic today is Seaborn. This has been an amazing work for our ensemble, and it's really been the cornerstone for the concerts that we've been playing in the recital hall so far. So we are here joined by the composer and the videographer, and I'd love to just hear a little bit about the project from you guys, and then we'll show a little clip after that.
Great. So I'll just give a quick overview. I'm the composer. So Seaborn is actually approximately 30-minute work in 3 sections, and I collaborated with Kjell on this, who decided that it would be great to shoot this in 3 parts. We have a first section above, which deals with only aerial photography of water, of the oceans. And then we have a second section which is shot entirely at the surface of the water, and a third section within, of course, underwater. So 3 sections, approximately 10 minutes each. Kjell, is there anything? Sorry, that was just kind of a very quick 30-second pitch of the film. But
so I'll talk a little bit about sort of the order in which the music and the film came. So from my perspective as a filmmaker, the piece was kind of reverse engineered. Movement 1 was written, the music for it was written pretty long in advance of shooting it by almost a year. The second movement was actually being written as I shot for it. So I had some sound bites to work from creatively, but no more than about 30 seconds. And then for the third movement, it had actually not yet been written when I initially shot the first 2 movements. So after I eventually did shoot movement 3, the basic architecture for the piece had changed quite a bit for the piece for the third movement. And its tone had also changed quite a bit. So I had to get pretty creative with figuring out how to weave the film with the music at that point.
Great. Thank you so much. And I look forward to diving into some of those questions that you brought up later on as well. But I think before we go too far, let's hear what we're talking about, hear and see it. So Doug, could we play the first minute or minute and a half from Seaborn? Okay. All right, thank you so much. Really wonderful music and just beautiful images as well. Thank you all so much for creating this piece for us, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about it now. Kjell, we talked about the process a little bit. Can you maybe expand a little bit more on this and what was unusual about the ordering of the process and kind of how that changed how you worked?
Yeah, so I think working, as far as the third movement is concerned, by the time I'd gotten to that, I was sort of already had movements 1 and 2 under my belt, which sort of allowed me to define the visual tone for the piece. But I think something that was interesting creatively was how Garth and I shared our ideas back and forth at the front end of the concept. I think Garth works with visual storytellers for a living, so this was kind of just like another day, I think, for him. And despite my background growing up around music, I sincerely had really no way of communicating with Garth in a way which made sense to me or to him. I couldn't speak the musical language in a sophisticated enough way to do justice to what we were trying to do. And so I had to kind of go back to basics and communicate visually by sketching out basic graphs that describe sort of tonal and energy changes, literally mapping out what the piece might look like. And in the concept and shooting phase, really the only thing that mattered to me was making sure that Garth and I were generally on the same page about the big and medium picture, the architecture of the piece at that point. And I sort of decided to leave worrying about details to the editing phase at the end of the process. And I think that ended up working out quite well for us.
Great. And Garth, we're going to talk a little bit more about your background in film music in a little, but can you just talk to us about this piece being written in a reverse order from what normally happens? Can you explain kind of the normal process of writing music for a film and how this was backwards of that?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say 90% of the projects that are sent my way, I'm really part of the post-production process, which just means that everything has been filmed, edited, sometimes in its final lock of edit, sometimes in not quite there. But very rarely would there be a case where I would write music first before I see any visuals and have it work in that opposite order. So this was kind of a refreshing and challenging process because of that. I will say Kjell was like extremely effective at communicating his ideas from the beginning. He sells himself a little bit short there, I think. But I think when I'm working with film directors, the biggest danger is when there's a film director who thinks that they know a lot about music, but they don't really, and they try to communicate with you in terms of music by saying, yeah, I think this section really needs some diminished chords or something there, or I think that yeah, definitely don't use the oboe here, that kind of thing. So I try to communicate in non-musical terms as much as possible, because ultimately that's what we're trying to communicate to the audience, right? Like, we don't want them to necessarily be impressed by like the finesse of how we use some like chord sequence or something. We want to communicate a feeling or an idea to them. So
yeah, was this process, did you find it refreshing to work in this more freeing way, or was it actually difficult to come up with ideas and concepts because there was no structure in place, or at least no visual structure in place?
Yeah, I think a little bit of both for sure. I mean, for me, staring at a blank page is always the scariest thing. So when you start out with some visual structure in place, it puts a little bit less pressure on me in some ways, maybe, but it also, I guess you could argue that it limits creativity, but that's always an interesting question. The more limits we have on ourselves, if that actually makes us more creative or less creative, I don't know. But I guess I'm curious for Kjell. You talked a little bit about it, but did you feel more creativity when you, for example, got to the third movement and did not have much of my material, or was that like limiting in some ways, like more challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'll talk about this a little later probably, but I think really, it's like, what did music guide you in this, or did photography or film guide you in this? And to be honest, not to sound cheesy, but sort of just the ocean in a lot of ways guided my process. And not having the third movement be as structured initially as the first movement was, just allowed me to really explore the experience of being in the water with the camera as as much as I wanted. It was really a question of, do I want to have a shot where I can see the surface? Do I want to have a shot where I don't see the surface? Is there a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? And that was literally about it. So I really was able to go into the water and not say, oh, the conditions today are too murky, or the sun's at the wrong angle for the shot that I envisioned. It was really like, okay, let me go out and let me just sort of go back to basics and see what I find. And that exploration was really, really pure, which I think I ended up coming away with a lot of shots and a lot of little subtle angles, which I might not have done had I adhered super strictly to a set plan. So I think in that way, I really, really enjoyed shooting the third movement because it felt the most personal for me.
That's great. And I have another interesting question for you, Kjell. And can you tell us a little bit about your story of becoming interested both in the water, the ocean specifically, and then becoming interested in ocean photography?
Yeah, so going back all the way back, I grew up on islands between Hawaii and the island of Mauritius. So the ocean has, to some extent, always been a present sort of energy in my life. And in my early teenage years, I took up competitive water sports. And the discipline that I grew into the most was solo distance paddling. And that requires you to be quite in tune with the ocean. When you're 15 miles offshore, or going for 15 miles, and you're a few miles offshore in fully open water by yourself, you sort of have to notice all the small details. And I'd like to think that, you know, once I had the interest to pick up a camera, which came entirely from a desire to sort of formally capture all of those details, I was kind of already prepared to go into it because I had that background.
Wonderful. And Garth, can you talk a little bit about your background as well? Because I think obviously our backgrounds inform so much of what we do as artists. And specifically, I'm interested in the lyrical quality of your compositional voice in this work. And was that influenced in some way by your own musical training? I know that you are a vocalist and talented multi-instrumentalist. Does that in any way inform your compositions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always does on some level. I grew up studying violin, and later on started studying voice, singing. I think for a while I thought I would be headed into career in performance in some aspect, and then early on in my undergraduate studies, I became more and more interested in composition, and some of my early projects were in film, actually, silent film. There were a few projects I did for Turner Classic Movies, where they were in a process of restoring a classic film from the 1920s that had lost its original soundtrack and needed new work. And so I found myself, kind of inspired by those late romantic giant composers Richard Strauss, or later on Korngold and Miklos Rosa. And a lot of those composers had made the move to Hollywood and, basically adapted their concert music writing techniques of that era to score Hollywood films. And I think that's the legacy that Hollywood has still inherited in typical soundtracks, right? From those kinds of people. So those were the first projects I had in writing for silent films like that, and much in that style, even though that's not really obviously the style that we score a lot of modern films today. But to your question about whether or not like being a vocalist or instrumentalist influences style of writing, I'm sure it does in many aspects. I think I hope a lot of my works tend to have a more lyrical, not necessarily melodic quality to them, but I've thought about before whether being a vocalist influences that quality of a composer's writing. And I think it does, but also being an instrumentalist, as an instrumentalist, a lot of times, obviously, we try to imitate vocal, lyrical qualities. And oftentimes, as a violinist or even as a percussionist, even though it's probably arguably much more difficult in some ways, we strive to create those qualities in a way that is even greater than what a human voice might be able to achieve naturally. So.
Great. And I'm interested to come back to this idea when we talk about second movement of this piece. Some of you guys know what I'm talking about, but we'll get there. So let's turn now to Bob van Sice. And I want to hear a little bit about why this project, why Garth, why Kjell, and how did this all come together?
Good morning, everybody. I think that just about every major project that ever happened in my own performance career or in any of these sort of things that I've guided, like the Percussion Collective, it's in fact composers and pieces that have initiated anything. And so I had this idea running around in my head for the Percussion Collective forever. I think I actually learned a little bit myself in one of the first of these that some of the guys were dating the very first years that I started talking about putting together the collective. And so it's just been a really long time that I was thinking about this. But I had sort of tagged Garth a little tiny bit. He probably didn't know he was being followed while he was in school, but I had heard a couple of his projects, just some by happenstance and some by design, and was really enamored with his work, and decided that I would sort of put into play one of the greatest privileges that is my career at Yale, when, as all of you know who've been students at Yale School of Music, you couldn't be in a more hotbed of great young composers. We're there with a faculty of who's who in the world of composition, and they sort of attract the future who's who in the world of composition. So I have just such a great pool of talent. Garth had particularly pulled my ear during his student time, and hearing a couple of his pieces and hearing the fabulous feedback from my students about how much they liked his music. And so I started to research where he was, Matt. I thought, okay, I mean, this guy writes all this great music for film. I got $10 that says he must be in Hollywood. So I started doing a little bit of research, found his website, and we eventually had contact. But it's through his fabulous projects that, I mean, he wrote student pieces that didn't even vaguely sound like they were written by a student. And all of us know this beautiful trailer that he made for the Yale School of Music that Dean Blocker asked him to make as a signature piece for the sort of front door of our website. And the beautiful music in the John Muir. I'm probably ahead of ourselves. I'm not supposed to unveil that we're going to play some of that beautiful music, but all these gorgeous pieces that were written then. And I thought, you know, what better to launch a really exciting program and an exciting ensemble than to go try to search out a really great piece. And I wanted somebody who could write us a piece that would transcend any barriers aesthetically, that somebody who had enough technique that it would appeal to a certain kind of audience that we had always played to, but somebody with a lyricism and an approachability to their music, and this word that's always seemed sort of, as Kjell used the word cheesy earlier, somebody who could just write really beautiful music. And Garth is so incredibly capable of doing all of the above. So
do you mind if we actually show one of these pieces? We got our hands on thanks to Garth. He is letting us show actually one of his pieces when he was a student, which is a multi-tracked saxophone piece. And we always remark that Bob has this amazing memory for certain experiences that he encounters. And from way back, Bob still remembers this piece at a New Music New Haven concert when Garth was a student at Yale. So Doug, would you mind putting up this saxophone piece that we can hear? All right, so there you have it. One of the first encounters between Bob van Sice and Garth. So that was the starting place. And now where have we gone from there? What was some of your other exposure to his work, and how'd you guys cross paths after that?
Well, we ended up meeting Matt in Pasadena for a lunch, if I remember correctly, the very end of 15, beginning of 16 somewhere, and throwing around the basic idea of would he accept a commission from us? And I remember, Garth, at that lunch, you said to me, can you tell me, Bob, are you looking for the stage concert music, or do you want the movie music? What exactly are you asking for? And I said, for God's sake, I want the movie music here, because I really want to do something that's going to involve visual images. And I'm just afraid that's the same kind of question from John Williams. You know, do you want me to write you something that sounds like my movies? Absolutely, categorically. And I think we got really something, Garth, that, and I'll let you be the judge of this, but really is the best of both worlds of yours. We got ourselves really what is your serious music for the concert stage, together with all the incredible gifts that you have of being able to paint images and sound.
Thanks so much, Bob.
Great. And how did the concept come into the Seaborn and the ocean images? Was that from Garth or you, or how did that all come together?
I'm one of these guys, Matt, you know me for years, who barely remembers what lunch was last Thursday. So I'm trying to dig back into exactly where that came. But as you all know, with my wife having grown up on a tropical island, and so much of our life having been spent around and loving the ocean, and with Kjell's webbed feet, I mean, my son swims more than he can walk. That I just really wanted to do something that would involve the magic of this thing that we love so much in our life. And it was at a time, too, where we were beginning to walk the beaches of a tropical island stuck in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a million miles from anywhere, and finding more garbage on the beaches than we were finding rocks. And so the idea of, let's see if we can make some form of a statement here and try to help people love and care for the ocean a little bit more. I think I'm not really so sure the ordering that all happened, but the purpose behind it was basically that. Garth, maybe your memory is a little bit more detailed than mine.
Actually, it's just as foggy, Bob. It's funny. Often I'll get to the end of a longer work, and you look back at the origins of it, and it almost seems mysterious how it comes of nothing, because you don't remember anything of the beginning processes or how you got to where you got.
Yeah, I think, Matt, it's just a mixture. I love the ocean. I love Garth's music. I adore Kjell's images. And I wanted to put together this collection of my former students to play in an ensemble. So if ever the word nexus was really appropriate, it's there.
Yeah, there's actually when we first premiered this work, it seems to me that this was a very special moment in a lot of ways. And correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but was this 30 years at Yale? Or how was it 20 years?
I'm old enough already. You don't need to add numbers on here. It was actually the anniversary of my 20th year teaching at YSM.
Excellent. So for anyone that isn't familiar with how we launched the collective, we came together, and all 18 members came to New Haven for this big concert. And it was really a celebration of not only all things Yale, but all things Bob and all things music. It was really an incredible night where we actually split up the movements of these two pieces amongst all of the members, and it was really a big party. As much as classical music concert can be a party, that's what it was, and it celebrated this new piece coming into life. And then there's another part of it that we haven't touched on yet. So for those of you who saw the names here, we have Bob van Sice and we have Kjell van Sice. And so if you didn't put that together, Kjell is Bob's son. And Kjell, I want to know, what's it like to work with your dad, and what does this mean to you guys? To this, as far as I know, this is the first time you have collaborated on something.
Yeah, this question came out of left field, but I guess I should have seen it coming. How was it collaborating with my dad? Well, the nice part is that I didn't really have to collaborate with him all that much. I don't mean that in a bad way, in that it was actually pretty independent. I spent a lot more mental energy with Garth than I did with my dad. It was more, I knew what he wanted to do, really. I knew as I saw the forest, you know, and then I just had to put in the trees. So it actually wasn't bad at all, and it was actually quite cool. It was especially fun when the piece was played at PASIC and had the opportunity to be, you know, directly involved with something which I'd been to when I was a kid, and sort of didn't really care why I was there when I was 6 years old. And then you know, I was there, and it all sort of had a little bit more story to it for me. So it was cool.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you. I'm sorry to put you in an uncomfortable position, but I've always just wondered. My father's a percussionist, and we work together, and these are always special things. So just wanted to ask and see that. We have oh, sorry, go ahead. That's right. He didn't say anything too bad. That's great. We have our first question coming in. This is from Connor Vietz, and it says, "Hi everyone. A question for Garth. Could you speak to the relationship between Seaborn and Reich's seminal work Sextet? Curious as to how the idea of a companion piece for the programmatic purposes influenced the compositional process."
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a great question, actually. Puts me on the spot a little bit thinking about the sextet, but I think when you think of Steve Reich's music, even though I would describe it as being different than my own music in many ways, we think about the way that we create energy, I think, in similar ways. So I would say what is similar is that we both often think of grooves or groove-based elements in our music, right? And besides there being some similar instrumentation between my work Seaborn, which is scored for 2 vibraphones, 2 marimbas, 2 pianos, as well as some auxiliary percussion. I think that probably the thing that's most similar is the way that we kind of try to channel energy or harness energy. Reich in a minimalist way, but he's always building on common elements. And percussionists can probably help me out a little bit more. Is it towards the end, like 12 beat patterns in the Reich that are third, right? And the way he plays with perception, like you have melodic elements kind of shifting and become accompaniment elements at different times. And I try to do that in my own way in Seaborn. You think of the culmination of the end of the Reich, the way it builds. There's just this sort of unharnessed energy was maybe in some ways the same approach I took to trying to cover the visuals of the large waves at the end of the first movement that we had. But percussionists, can you add anything to that? You're probably in a better position after playing both works to assess that.
Connor, I can answer your question a little bit more of a nuts and bolts fashion. When I first sat down in Pasadena to talk about the commission with Garth, one of the things that I told him is that during my entire career as a guy involved in the world of percussion chamber music, one of the things that I hate in a percussion concert is play a piece for 10 minutes, move gear for 10 minutes, play a piece for 4 minutes, play and move gear for 10 minutes. Is I said to Garth, listen, I hope you can accept these constraints, but one of the things I want to do is to give you an instrumentation here that basically is derived from the piece which this is going to be paired with in concerts. So the footprint of the instrumentation, Connor, came from the footprint of Sextet. So there was, besides just sort of an aesthetical connection between these 2 pieces, there was really a very practical and logistical connection.
Great. Well, let's move on to hear some more music at this point. So we're going to talk about the first movement of Seaborn, and this is Above. And let's listen to the last 2 minutes of this where things really kind of get whipped up. Can we hear that, Doug? Beautiful, just amazing. Every time we see that, I can't believe the type of percussion work that we have now. It's just such an amazing piece. Thank you both so much for creating this for us. Garth, I want to ask you the next question. That is because, again, the process was reversed on this, that the music came first and then the video. Did you have images in mind of what you thought the video would look like as you were writing the music? And then, if so, did Kjell's images fit with that, or did it actually change completely how you saw the piece?
Yeah, so more or less, early on, Kjell was really great at showing me a lot of his pre-existing work. He does a lot of still photography, of course. So I had a pretty good sense of where we were headed with the different movements. As you just saw in the first movement, all aerial photography. And we knew that the style of that photography was going to be a little bit more concrete, as opposed to being abstract, as we see in the third movement. I'm sure Kjell can go into more of that once we see some of the second and third movement. But the short answer to your question is yes. I had a pretty good sense of exactly what would be coming my way, and of course there's an element that's missing, which is sort of the pacing and the energy of what we then do with the edits. But overall, I had a pretty good concept of the imagery.
Great. And Kjell, I want to ask you about the process of filming this. I know that there are many wild stories of how you were able to get this footage and the gear that went into it. Can you tell us, especially this last section that we saw, tell us about this day and what was special about it?
Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit, perhaps about shooting everything, and then I'll talk about that specific sequence. But so as we said before, Seaborn's in 3 parts, and you have the aerial, surface, and underwater. And shooting the aerial sequence for the first movement ended up being best done with a drone versus being done out of a helicopter, for just having flexibility of being able to travel to very specific locations, flexibility of timing, and access. So that was a pretty fun, very sketchy process, taking off and landing from boats in often very windy and rough conditions. So a lot of logistics there. For the surface and underwater sequences in the other movements, I shot with a fairly standard high-speed cinema camera and a cinema lens setup that was put together in a surf housing. It's pretty decent size, probably about 2.5 or 3 feet long by about 10 inches.
Surf housing, meaning that it's waterproof in a surf housing, is that?
Yeah. So okay. So a surf housing is like a dive housing, just not rated to go to the depth that a dive housing is. It's a little bit less heavy, but it still is large and weighs about 30 pounds, and you have to swim with that in whatever conditions it may be. But yeah, those kinds of setups are pretty hard to come by, especially on the rental market. And the entire setup that I was swimming with costs, to put it in terms which are relatable, about 4 to 6 marimbas. About 4 to 6 marimbas that you're swimming with in your hand that you don't want to lose and you cannot let get wet. So almost nobody's going to let you get a hold of that kind of camera, let alone bring it into the ocean. And sure as heck, no insurance is going to cover you. So you're on your own. But luckily in Hawaii, which is where I shot the second and the third movement, we have one of the strongest surf photography and film industries. So there are a number of ways to get a hold of that kind of equipment without having to personally invest in that 4 to 6 marimbas. So.
Good. And how about that specific day?
Right. So as everything is in the ocean, you have to wait for it to come to you. You can put yourself in the right place and you can put yourself in the right region in the best season, but you might totally get skunked and have the worst conditions in the world. I just got really lucky that the day when I shot that sequence, the aerial sequence of the big waves down in Mauritius, we had a pretty massive swell roll through with perfect weather conditions, perfect wind. Yeah, the waves that morning were about as pretty as what you'd find in the South Pacific. The shooting window for when we shot that was probably about an hour to an hour and a half of good wind, good weather, good swell. And coordinating getting those waves into your shot, into your field of view on the drone is kind of like trying to track a motorcycle going the opposite way on the highway with looking through a straw. That's kind of what it's like. So there's a lot of different things to coordinate. You have to both look out at the horizon and also look down at what you're shooting and try and coordinate what's coming and what you're shooting. And so it's kind of a fun process.
Great. I love hearing these stories. I think it's... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kerry.
No. I was just going to ask, so you're talking about flying a giant drone in very windy weather. Is this something you knew how to do before this moment? You had experience flying drones?
Yeah, so I spent about, probably somewhere 4 or 6 months, I think, before flying out to shoot this, getting my FAA certification to fly this drone commercially, which was a lot of studying. I had to take a test in an airport. I basically had to get some degree of a pilot's license to fly it. The drone I was flying was pretty big. And so, no, I did not have prior drone flying experience. I spent, like I said, about 6 months learning to fly a drone just to shoot the aerial sequence.
That's amazing. It sounds to me like your sport or your water sport experience was really essential to sort of tracking these big waves and knowing what's going to happen with the ocean. You know, I would have no idea if the waves are going to be big and beautiful or not at all. You know, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
All right. We have another question that came in for Garth. This is from Lewis and it says, "Hello, everyone. For Garth, how did you approach the orchestration of the material? Did you start with just the music, then orchestrate, or compose for the instrumentation? Some of the orchestrational decisions are really striking, like using almost the entire marimba range, and I'm wondering how you got there." And then he says he loves the piece. Thank you, Lewis.
Oh, thanks, Lewis. Yeah, that's an interesting question. First of all, I'm definitely not a percussionist. I haven't written that many percussion works in my life. So early on when we were starting the piece, I spoke with Bob a few times and I said, well, how do I know like what's possible with these instruments? And he said, Garth, just, write this. My guys can play anything. So, and it was true. And that was really a gift for me, just to have that creative freedom. They tell some composers when they're writing for mallet instruments just to use 2 fingers or something like that at the keyboard to make things idiomatic. So I tried to, use some of those techniques to keep things at least playable in my view. But as far as orchestration goes, I think that as a film composer, I do a lot of work in a DAW, working in like Logic or Cubase. And so a lot of the orchestration kind of came naturally as I was working through elements. I'm inspired always by sound of the instrument. So it's hard for me to sometimes be away and just working with pencil and paper and then translating later to orchestration. I prefer to just hear those sounds come together from the get-go.
Great. And we have one more question that came in before we go to the second movement. So let's get this. This is from actually a collective member, Ian Rosenbaum, who wants to know about how the piece was funded. There were many different pieces to raise the money for the filming, the composition, getting everyone in the same place. So what was the process for that, and who do we have to thank for all of that?
That's one that we have a big thank you to shout out, and that is to the wonderful Brookby Foundation, which is in Milwaukee. Yeah, the thanks to them, this exists, and they have helped us in so many ways. So I can't make a bigger shout out to those marvelous people. It would be impossible to exaggerate my gratitude. They gave us a grant that included both the filming of the piece and Garth's writing of the music, and have been so generous to even have supported the recording of the piece that we just finished doing in Miami for the commercial CD that'll be coming out. So, you know, we're ever so grateful for private philanthropy. I lived for a good portion of my adult life in Europe, where pieces are commissioned oftentimes by governments and foundations that are government-based. And since moving back to the States, we've really found that is basically still the same thing, but just in a little different bit of a guise. The fact that a patron of the arts, Ian, is able to reduce their gift in their tax filing the next year actually kind of amounts to a roundabout way of government funding. So a portion of that money that came to us from the Brookby Foundation, although it came from them and their generosity, a portion of that actually roundabout came from the American government because of our tax law and the fact that our tax law is sort of induces philanthropy. So there were any number of partners, I guess, as you say, but between the government and the Brookby Foundation, but those people couldn't be more marvelous. They're also very concerned with things ecological of every sort, and they're helping to clean up our waters. They're helping to do any number of things besides their generosity to the world of music. And these are folks out there really making a difference.
Well, we are ever so grateful to that foundation. Thank you so much. Let's see a little clip of movement 2 now. So we talked movement 1 was all shot above. Now movement 2, we move a little closer to the water, and now we're talking about the surface of the ocean. Doug, could we see a little clip from movement 2? So Garth, something that is rather subtle in that movement, but pretty shocking and a bold decision was the use of voice from the players. Could you talk a little bit about what that is and why you made that call?
Yeah, it was something that I've been wanting to try for a while with instrumental ensemble. And when I was digging around for some source material, I found this beautiful, just simple motif that was from sort of one of these historical source recordings that ethnomusicologists were starting to make in the 60s and 70s for different institutions like the Smithsonian. And I found this little melody from Mauritius, actually. And that kind of served as the basis for the start of this second movement that uses vocals from the ensemble. So each member is required to sing along with their playing.
Great.
And it's worth an anecdote at this moment. When we first got it and everybody called me back, who was looking at their parts going, "Bob, do you realize we have to play and sing here, huh?" I said, I may know about that because Garth actually said to me, you know, when I was in school with these guys, they seem like they can do anything. Can I ask you, Bob, can they sing too? And of course, the typical Bob getting everybody in trouble is, oh, sure. All of them, don't hesitate at all, go for it. And so I have to plead guilty in getting you guys into that.
Oh, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And am I right that this is actually the first material that you heard, or the first music that was written for the work?
It's the first material that was sent to us. We were actually, funny enough, Garth had started writing, and we were in Mauritius itself on a vacation. And the music had just come, and we were driving down to the south of the island, and we put it on in the car. So the very first time that I heard the first bits of sequencer tape was in Mauritius and on a beautiful day in the car. And I remember Garth in his typical humility saying, listen, here's the first idea of what I've got in mind. If this is just terrible, just tell me and we'll see again. And all of a sudden came on this magical music that is the second movement. You know, only Garth writes these magical pieces and then asks you if this is okay and it's going to be good. And yeah, in a day of overconfidence, somebody that gifted with a bit of humility is really refreshing. And so this is the very first music that we heard.
And Garth, did you imagine this being the first movement, or it just happened to be the first music that you wrote and you knew maybe it wouldn't start the piece?
Yeah, I think I was kind of envisioning it as being the maybe the middle of the work. A lot of times I'll try to work that way just so I have a sense of where I need to arrive to and where I'm going from there. So I work from the middle outwards sometimes. But from this melody, it's kind of based off of these just the interval of a second. And that was something kind of instrumental in just forming the rest of the work. For me, that closeness of the second is kind of like where the horizon meets the water, and served as kind of the impetus for different movements.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit more about the video at this point. So this is to Garth. I want to ask you about the video. You work with so many videographers. How was this project different than what you've done before? Because I imagine that a lot of what you do is writing with a story. There's a plot. We're talking movies or documentaries in some way. And then in a lot of ways, this is a little bit more of an art film. It certainly has a narrative, but there's no plot per se. And how was that different, this experience with Kjell versus what you normally do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the challenge, right? Is creating some sort of narrative and structure without it feeling too maybe forced or manipulative or obvious. I think, obviously with a normal film, that structure is usually in place. We know that there's going to be introductory material, and then maybe 2/3 of the way through, we're going to get some sort of challenge and then resolution, right? But in this case, obviously none of that was there. But I think structuring it the way we did, where we have those 3 different perspectives, is a really unique way of looking at one object in different ways. Whether it be someone like Monet, who painted his haystacks from different lighting, right? In a similar way, I think we did that with the ocean, right? We looked at it from those different perspectives, and that became our structure.
Great. We actually have a video of some of your other work that we'd like to show at this point, just to see what else you do. And you wrote this piece for the Born Ultimatum. and which I was not familiar that was you before. And then I find out that it's this big motion picture, and it turns out it's Garth up there conducting and writing the music.
So to be completely fair, I wish it was me for that particular music, but this was actually part of a workshop at that time. So I was just composing a short excerpt for the film. But
I see. Okay, well, this will still be great insight.
Credit where credit is due. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Doug, you mind if we see what he wrote to this scene?
We have to move. Answer your phone.
You got a visual?
Where the hell is he, people?
Do exactly as I said. When you move up to your right, first escalator on the right. Tie your shoe right now. Tie your shoe. Wait. I'm gonna walk by you. I want you to move along the far wall to your left. 4, 3, 2, 1, stand up. That's it.
Who's got it? Where the hell is he? We cannot afford to lose this guy, people.
All right, that line you're on is good. Stay on that line. Stay on that line.
Wonderful. Well, I think you should have written the music for that movie, because that was just awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Kjell, can we talk a little bit about your video for the second movement? And one, am I right that this was not filmed in Mauritius? So here we transition to Hawaii, is that correct?
Yeah, second and third movement were shot in Hawaii.
Okay, and for me, what's so striking in the second movement is the change from these intense blues in movement one to all of a sudden gray and yellow and gold and all of that. Can you talk about what the experience was shooting this and how you came up with this as the version of Surface?
Yeah, so I think, kind of like what Garth was saying, the idea for us revolved around the ocean being a truly three-dimensional object, and that normally you don't experience it that way. Normally, the only perspective you ever have is really the surface, and maybe aerial, looking out of an airplane. And the thing about the surface, which is so cool, is that it's thinner than a human hair, right? And it's all held together by surface tension. So you have this thing which seems so big, and when you have a wave breaking, seems so dimensional and so heavy. But in reality, it's all based around this incredibly thin layer. And the way that light interacts with that can fundamentally change minute by minute, hour by hour, your perspective of what that thing is. So, when it came to choosing what to shoot for the surface, I really just started from the perspective, again, of, okay, what does it look like from, the water's right here and your eyes are looking out, what do you see? And of course, the whole sequence, the yellow and gold sequence there with the sun and the water, for me, that's like one of the most beautiful perspectives you can have in the ocean, and you can really highlight that with a camera. So that was a natural choice, because you sort of lose your sense of place and your sense of self, and it's sort of just a question of time, really. And so I think that in a way was sort of a nice metaphor for how the music worked.
I absolutely agree. When you were saying that, and you lose your sense of time and your sense of place, that one of the things that is striking about this movement is that in a way it sounds repetitive, but not. It's not. It's repetitive in kind of the surface level of everything, but inside there's constant variation going on, and it really has that same effect of ebbing and flowing, and you lose your sense of where the beat is, where the pattern is, all of these things, because it's constantly shifting. Is that something that you were thinking about, Garth?
Yeah, definitely. It's something I thought about too, and I think Matt, that's probably a really nice way of you saying as a percussionist that it's a pain in the butt to keep track of where all those patterns are heading, because I've gone back over the way I've written some of that, and I thought, would this have the same effect if we just created these regular patterns, even if they were longer patterns? And I think that it does need some of that variance to catch the sort of random varieties of little sparkles we see on screen, little lens flares, things like that. So.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask Kjell, so you heard this music first, and I think to us, it's, you know, it's this really beautiful, specific color, this atmosphere you've created. I'm wondering if this was the image you had in mind when you heard the music, or if this was the result of some experimentation and some improvisation on your end. I just wanted to see if you could dig into that process a little bit.
Yeah, so I think for that movement, especially for the first, I think the second movement, aside from the third movement, I think the second movement was the easiest to figure out how to shoot, just like from a natural basis. The first movement was definitely the most complex. Second movement was the most natural, and third movement was the most experimental. So with that being said, yes, the first sequence of the second movement was like, this has to be what it is, right? There was almost no other possibility. And one detail I actually wanted to mention on time is the first sequence of the second movement is all shot in slow motion at 300 frames per second. So that's the only way you can see that level of detail when you have the sun and the waves going in front of it. And when you actually translate, when you do the math, I think it's only something like 20 seconds worth of time, and maybe even less than that, 15 seconds worth of real time, which is kind of cool because you have this entire story unfolding in the music, but it's in an absolutely really short snippet of real time in the film.
Matt, if I could jump in here for just a second, I think that the beginning of second movement is such a special moment in the journey of the piece. Is for those of us who watch it from the audience, and I've played it a few times at the same time. You know, Terry and Matt, when we're on stage and you can audibly hear people gasp at the beginning of when the first image comes up of the second movement. And, you know, I think it's the quintessential example of this sort of aesthetical brotherhood that these two guys developed in this project. I can never decide whether they're gasping because of the beauty of the sound or the gorgeous nature of the image, or it's because of the combination of the two. And I think it's one of my very favorite moments in the experience, but you can always viscerally get a sensation from the stage when people just say, oh, and you can hear it coming on out loud onto the stage. It's a magical moment in the piece.
Yeah, everything about that movement is so striking, from the singing to the sound world to the images. That's definitely a highlight in the piece, and just an amazing moment in the experience of those 30 minutes. So let's go on to movement 3 now, and we're going to see a little clip from the beginning of this, and now we are below. We are underneath the water for this last movement. Doug, you mind if we watch a little bit of that? So we've now seen clips from all three of the movements, and as you can see, the entire piece goes from concrete to abstract. And this is a question for both Garth and Kjell about what you think of that process. Is there a metaphor behind that? And was that a conscious decision?
Yeah, I think that, not to sound vague, but especially the end of the third movement, is kind of meant to be whatever you want it to be. So it's supposed to be a space for sort of meditative reflection, a return to sort of a base, an energy base, a stable base. I think by the end of the film, by the time you get to the third movement of the piece, you want a moment to sort of just be with the water itself, and you're given progressively throughout the third movement less and less of a point of view. It becomes sort of a shot without perspective almost. You sort of just exist with the motion of the ocean, because hopefully by the end of the piece you're increasingly in tune with the way that the ocean works.
Right. Well, you have such a unique perspective on water, and it's amazing to get to see this perspective and to experience in a piece that none of us get to see it that way. None of, at least myself, I'm not diving under the water and seeing it that way. And so I really, it means a lot to be able to see a new perspective on that. And how about you, Garth? Is choosing to end the piece this way? It's a strong statement. Why do that?
Yeah, I think early on we had some discussions about the structure of the piece, whether it would actually maybe be reversed and we would start, from within, surface, and then finish with aerial. And I think, or perhaps have a third movement like we do, but end with more of a larger gesture. And all of those things felt a little bit cheap. And I think that exactly what Kjell said, there's something profound about bringing everything in a little bit closer and ending on a note that can really be interpreted however you want. And even within the third movement, it starts with the slow material, and then we end that movement with actually the same material. And compositionally, it can be dangerous to repeat yourself that way, because it can also feel sort of lazy, maybe like you're just repeating the same material. But for me, I wanted this sense of you're revisiting a piece the same way that, like, as musicians, we come back at different stages in our life and play a piece maybe that we studied when we were younger, but we've evolved and we're bringing so much deeper meaning to it. So I wanted that sort of experience when we revisit that material at the very end of Seaborn.
And there is, what I'm hearing from both of you guys is that there is this somber and intimate feeling at the end of the piece. And this actually brings up, Kjell, I'm going to quote you, so be ready, okay? It's an unofficial quote. But this comes back from when you did a pre-concert talk at PASIC for that concert. And one of the things that was remembered from that was you saying, you don't take care of anything that you don't love, and you can't love anything that you don't understand. And there is a whole dimension to this piece that is about caring for the ocean and what it means to you and what it should mean to people. Can you talk about that sentiment?
Yeah, I think that's not my original quote. That was something from a shark conservationist who I used to dive with, who said something along those lines. But I think it's that quote sort of illustrates the connection between conservation and understanding. And I think conservation, like in a broader sense, not just the way that it relates to the ocean. I think it's the way that it relates to anything in a broader sense of conservation. I like to think that understanding in that sense is not so much intellectual as much as it is emotional. I think emotional understanding so much is totally disconnected or discredited from intellectual understanding. And I think that you can't have one without the other. So in that way, it's kind of about empathy. You can acquire as much scientific or practical knowledge as you want about the ocean or about ocean conservation. But if you haven't gone there and built an emotional, personal connection with the water at some point, how much do you actually really understand it?
Yeah, and one thing we forgot to mention in the first movement that I think you can speak to a little bit more is that all of the coral or the reef that you're seeing underneath the water, that is all dead. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, the vast majority of it is dead. I don't know if we have the time for me to go into a little more detail, but
Please do.
the Indian Ocean is, I don't know if it's I know it's one of the warmest oceans in the world. And you see this a lot that in Australia, and most famously on the Great Barrier Reef, it's been experiencing the largest bleaching event over the last several years due to rising temperatures in the ocean, which basically kills off the bacteria that lives in coral polyps. And when those coral polyps die, the coral turns white, it bleaches. What gives coral its color is the polyp that lives inside of it. And so what you see in Mauritius is not just white coral. There are some areas of white coral, but a lot of coral that's dead and then been covered just by plankton, basically. And it just takes kind of a brown, dull color. And everything else that you see that's a blue color or kind of a whitish color is just sand.
Okay. And I think that this raises an interesting question that all artists think about, which is what can we do to help causes or things that are happening that we feel very strongly about? And while we might not have the power to do everything we wish we could do, one of the things that we can do is draw attention to various things. And so by creating art, writing pieces, shooting photos or videos that show people kind of what is out there is at least a way of drawing attention to it. And in that way, I think that you guys have done your part and done an important part to get this out there. I wanted to ask you guys a reverse question right now. So Garth, I want to ask you about the images, and Kjell, I want to ask you about the music. So Kjell, I'm going to start with you. You have a very unusual musical upbringing in that you grew up with Bob, and I'm curious how your musical understanding has developed and what you think you may have gained from that, or being around this, even as not a professional musician yourself, but how has that influenced your understanding and how to handle a piece like this?
Yeah, I feel like I'm probably going to give kind of a disappointing answer, but I think that growing up around music in my family, music was sort of second nature to me. I briefly practiced actually playing music, but not for very long, and it was sort of just a part of life. Hearing all these pieces was just a normal part of life, like getting up in the morning, putting on your clothes, having breakfast. So at a certain point, I didn't consciously notice it anymore. So I think on some level there must be some subconscious education, but really I think more than anything, just being in the ocean taught me a lot about how to just help me refine my perspective a little bit and my awareness. And I think that actually perhaps may have done the most for me.
Okay, and Garth, we know about Kjell's relationship with the water and with the ocean, but how about yours? Is this something that you have been passionate about? You live near the ocean in California. What's your relationship like with the water?
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in Wisconsin, and the only thing notable about the very small town that I grew up in was that it was right on the coast of Lake Michigan. So that was my experience with water growing up. So I have a lot of fond memories, of course, tied to one of the Great Lakes, but not that much experience with the ocean. But I think one thing that is beautiful about the ocean, right, is the tremendous power that it has, and the tremendous calm that it can have, that dynamic range. And so amazing material to try to put into music, or to try to mirror in some ways, right?
Yeah. Well, we have another question here before we go to our follow-up portion of today's event, and this comes from Matt Boyle, who seems to know about the concerto version. So he said, what was the process for rearranging the piece as a concerto for orchestra and for the performers? And so Terry, maybe you can speak to this. How does the experience of playing it change when playing it as a concerto?
Do you want me to go ahead, or should?
Yeah, Garth, why don't you go ahead? Tell us about arranging the piece for as a concerto.
Yeah. So after the premiere of the sextet version, it was a conversation we had. We wanted to make sure that it could benefit from sort of a orchestrated version, and we call it a concerto because that's like the format of the instrumentation that we think of, right? But I like to think of it more as just a work for percussion and orchestra, because we didn't want this idea of that there's just featured soloists and then background orchestra. We really wanted it to be an equal element, and so that was somewhat of the challenge after the fact, was finding a way to have there be that sort of symbiotic relationship between orchestra and percussion, and not just background supporting material.
Okay, great. And so maybe actually we'll have Bob answer this next question, who was at the premiere and has had such an intimate relationship with this piece. These two versions, how do they differ? What does it add? Is one more enjoyable, or are these just different?
Well, I think just the smallest bit of information is that we had a gentleman by another Bob named Bob Moyer, who used to be the artistic guy at Pittsburgh Symphony for a long time and is a friend of mine from early in my adult life, who has been a consultant for our project since the Percussion Collective began. And I think besides all of us in this conversation, he may be the person on the planet who loves Seaborn the most. And he said to me at one of the concerts, I think it was at the great performance in Baltimore, I think he brought up the idea. He said, can you imagine this gorgeous piece if it was filled out with a lush orchestration? And unfortunately, for all of us who are percussionists and who have played and loved the Bartók Sonata for two pianos and two percussion, we adore that piece in its original guise, and it maybe didn't make itself out so well when Bartók decided to orchestrate it later in his life. And I was just a little tiny bit afraid that this magical piece that I love so much with Seaborn may suffer the same fate. So I kind of went into that tiptoeing a little bit, but the surprise, Garth came through again. And the piece from the audience, the lushness and all this brand new counterpoint of these new notes that we don't have in the original version, that's running cross current, if you will, against some of the music and the fast music, and the amazing moments which already make you gasp from beauty that are even more lush. It's just fantastic. I really do hope, Matt, that we have the opportunity to play the orchestrated version as often as we've had the privilege of playing it in recital. I just think it has so much to say, and but it becomes a different thing. It's another creature in that guise. And some of the moments are just spectacularly beautiful. And I think the fact that also Garth chose not to use anything but strings was a really great choice, because from having played concertos for so long myself, we're all tired of having to hammer a marimba to where it ends up sounding like a xylophone anyway when you're playing a concerto just to get up and over the orchestration. The fact that we're just against this palette, or the canvas, as Garth calls it, of the strings, just allows the six of the guys to play as we normally play without having to play with this excruciating dynamic to be heard. So I just hope that the marketplace is going to allow us to do that. We had a absolutely spectacular experience with Teddy Abrams, who conducted the premiere in Louisville, and boy, have we been just so lucky, just collaborating with such a terrific and open-minded musician for the first time to bring that to life.
Great. Now we're so excited and can't wait to bring that piece, this orchestrated version, around many more places. I hope that you get to hear it soon at a symphony near you. So we'll move on to the last portion of our talk today. We just want to do a little bit of a follow-up. And so if anyone has last-minute questions that you want to put in for our two wonderful guests, now would be the time to do so. But for now, I want to talk about some other projects that you guys do. So the question is, Kjell, what's your other work like? And while you talk about that, Doug's actually going to run some images of yours across the screen.
Yeah, my portfolio primarily consists of outdoor and sport still imagery. So just photographs. most of that work is pointed toward sustainability issues. Hopefully an increasing amount is pointed towards sustainability issues that surround the ocean, and to an extent land-based sustainability issues. But I work across the board in ad, product, campaign, and editorial sides of the outdoor industry. So kind of a broad variety of applications. And my work also includes graphic design, which I actually teach a class in at my alma mater.
Great. And how about besides the water, besides the ocean, what are the things that interest you, or what do you want to be able to photograph? Or is it just the water?
Yeah, I mean, increasingly it's everything that's outdoor related. I think, regardless of what the sport is or what the location is, the whole idea is to create work or to create products that, help people get involved with being outside, being outdoors, and especially things where you can ride things, right? Whether it's riding surfboards or other sorts of things, things that give you an experience. I think that can totally change your life.
Yeah, well, being outside is certainly something we are all missing right now. So hopefully soon we can do that again. And Garth, I want to show a video of one of yours, or one of your pieces. And if we could let's do the Why Music video, Doug. If we could play that, and then Garth will talk about some of your other projects and what you're up to now and what sort of things you do.
Why do we make music?
Girarti furtivo in queste mura, non odi tu
That's really an amazing video and something that's very special to all of us who went to Yale. So everything that was shown, all of the images that you saw were from the Yale School of Music and Yale in general. And it's actually the first thing that anyone who has gone to Yale in the past maybe 6 or 7 years, when you go to convocation, that is the first thing you are shown as, like, welcome to being a student here. And that was, without knowing it, that was my first introduction to Garth's music, only later to find out that that was him. So what else are you up to now, Garth? What other projects are you doing, and what's going on?
Yeah, well, as many of you know, I divide my time between writing film music and concert music. And so at the moment in the concert music realm, I'm working on a piece that I'm very excited about for the Percussion Collective, as well as a group of fantastic choral singers that will hopefully have its premiere at Yale in the fall. And that's also water themed. This time it's the working title is The Memory of Water. So it's going to be exploring water and what water means to us from a completely different perspective. So besides that, in the film realm, I do a lot of advertisement work, TV work. Things have certainly changed the way that we work on those projects as well. Right now, in our current situation, we're not able to go into a room and record, 40 or 50 musicians, right? So I think it has us all thinking a lot about really the luxury that we have to experience music making with other people and with live audiences. And I think once we get back to that point, it will really change the way that we think about that, right?
Yeah. So Garth, we have another question that just came in for you. This is from Glenn C., who just wants to know, what was your initial education and interaction like, and how did you get started in composing? So what were your early musical training, and how did you get started writing?
Yeah, so my parents were both music teachers, actually. My mom and dad taught music in the public schools, and when I grew up in a small town, and so I didn't have a lot of access to classical concerts, especially. But when I was 4 years old, the great violinist Itzhak Perlman came to our small town to give a concert, and so that was my first concert, and I asked for a violin after that. So I grew up studying violin, and then it wasn't until a little bit later, I think it was my freshman undergrad music theory class that inspired me to try to break the rules a little bit more of composing and music. I wanted to write all of those stacked fifths that we heard in the saxophone piece that we played. So almost in a little bit of a rebellious way, I think that inspired me to start composing.
Now, I imagine you spend a lot of time in recording studios just for what type of work you do. And I'm wondering if you could talk, and maybe we could have several people talk about the recording session that you did with the collective, our new album coming out, and what that was like, how that differs from what you normally do. And then we can hear from Bob and Terry about that session as well. But Garth, could you kick us off on how was that different than your normal Hollywood recording sessions?
Yeah, well, I think I'd be even more interested to hear the player's perspective, but just quickly from my perspective, two things. I think the luxury of time going into that recording session, even though it was still, we accomplished so much in the few days that we had to record. Usually in a typical LA recording session, we'd have one or two takes of material before we really have to move on. The other luxury that I had were players who were so dedicated to that material coming into the session. And that's not to say that LA studio musicians aren't, but still, it's a different process. They're coming into the stage and they're sight reading material. And for all purposes, it is a job for them, as opposed to you guys who have had this material for a few years and really just brought such a level of a dedication and integrity to it.
Yeah, Terry, can you talk about those couple days and what that was like?
Yeah, I think Garth, that's really well said. Like the big advantage was this asset of time. On one level, we've spent many years kind of living inside this piece and really refining what it means to us and how we play this piece. And then on the other hand, I think we're super grateful Svet Stoyanov and the group gave us amazing time and amazing space down at his university in Miami, and we just had this amazing luxury. We had this amazing, beautiful concert hall and a great team, and all the time we needed to kind of make the work that we wanted to. So I think we're really grateful for that.
Yeah. How about Bob? Anything you want to add about what that process was like?
I think that process, Matt, is like anytime you make a record, especially anytime you make a record of a piece that you really love, you feel this huge responsibility that's about to be a document that's going to live for years and years on end, and that this may be the portal through which many percussionists over the next generation have their first encounter with this piece and will then want to go and play it. And I thought that responsibility felt the heaviest on our shoulders of, I mean, we could sit around and play Seaborn all day just because we love to play it and because we just enjoy swimming around in it. But the responsibility of what that was going to be as a long-term document, I think we felt very heavily, and couldn't have been happier. Everything from the recording team to the performance from the players for 2 days. Boy, you could have counted on two hands the amount of wrong notes that were played in crazy hard music in 2 long days of playing. And I just couldn't have been prouder of everybody. And I think that leads me into just a very quick thing to say, Matt, so I just make sure I take advantage of this. As an art form, as percussionists, we're only as good as the music that we have to play. And so this responsibility for us of getting great pieces for our art form to move forward is enormous. But one of the things that we have to always be careful of, those of us who have the privilege of commissioning and giving the world premieres of so many of these pieces, especially pieces that become seminal pieces like this, is that we don't feel any sense of ownership of the piece. It's sort of like having your kids. You bring them into the world, but you don't own them. And that you try as hard as you can to make sure that you've done the best you can to introduce the world to this beautiful soundscape and these incredible images, but then that the piece belongs to the art form in general. And that one of the most exciting parts of this is what almost seems counterintuitive. We should all be moping that the exclusivity that for us to perform this with the Percussion Collective for us is over. And so now these other people are going to touch our piece. I feel exactly the opposite is, oh my gosh, now we get to the end of the exclusivity period on the commission. And now all these people around the world who have heard this piece, heard about it, have loved hearing it, can now experience the joy that this thing feels to play it themselves now that it's open to the rest of the percussion community to play. And my gosh, I just hope hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people over decades play this. It's got to give, it does give percussion, especially tuned percussion playing, one of the most beautiful platforms and voices of anything that we have to play.
I think people are going to be thrilled to hear that they can play it now, and I'm sure they can't wait to get out and check it out. So, Kjell, can you tell everyone how they can get a hold of this piece?
Yeah, so I think we'll have this brought up on the stream in the chat, so you don't have to go by my pronunciation. But if you go to my website, so kjellisay.com, and shoot me an email, which is kjell@kjellisay.com. There's also a form for that on my website. Through me, you can go ahead and learn all about rentals for recital, and once the exclusivity period is over as well for the concerto version.
Great, thank you so much. So at this point, I hope you guys have had a great time listening to this. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you to our guests, Garth Neustadter and Kjell van Sice. Thank you to my co-hosts, Terry Sweeney and Bob van Sice. And thank you so much to Doug Perry for doing all of the behind-the-scenes work. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, everyone.